freedom wasn't necessarily a locational thing. It wasn't necessarily like Canada. It wasn't terra firma. You didn't have to necessarily get to a particular geographic location. Freedom was, something within. It was the ability to chart one's own course and to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now. The farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in. Good morning and happy summer solstice. It's just me today to introduce our special guest for this special bonus episode. If you're a Good Dirt listener, you know that we drop episodes every Friday, but we are dropping a special episode today, June 19th, in honor of Juneteenth, or Emancipation Day. We had such an amazing conversation with our friend Tony back in February. That episode is called Preserving the History of the Underground Railroad with Tony Cohen. I recommend, if you haven't listened to it, definitely go back and give it a listen. So we invited him back to tell us all about Juneteenth and to give us some of history and context around emancipation and what that means. And if you haven't met Tony yet, he's a historian, nonprofit founder, and an author who operates Button Farm, Maryland's only living history center depicting 19th century slave plantation life and the heroic story of the Underground Railroad. He is the founder and director of the Minare Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to the creation of cutting-edge educational programs, including an Underground Railroad immersion experience based on the work he did with Oprah Winfrey. So we hope you enjoy this episode and learn a lot. We definitely did, and celebrate in this joyous day. Happy summer, everyone.
Juneteenth is a celebration of emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. It is a nationwide holiday that got its origins in Texas, the past century and a half, to, really capture the imagination of Americans. It's called Juneteenth because it marks the day, June 19th, 1865, where enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, were told that they had been freed. And so in true folkloric African-American style, instead of saying, hey, let's celebrate the 19th day of June, 1865, they, of course, came up with Juneteenth as a shorthand for something that was pretty big in the experience.
And just to clarify, for some people may not know, from my understanding from history class, slaves were emancipated much earlier than June 19th, 1865, correct? So why is that the date that we celebrate?
Yes, and I have to say, I would still argue that the definitive book on emancipation has yet to be written.
Cool.
But most people know from school upbringing about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation from 1863. And in the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln basically freed the enslaved people who were held in bondage in the Confederate States. The only rub with that was Lincoln didn't have control over the Confederate States. And so historians say that even though it was a powerful and symbolic act, that it did not free a single enslaved person. After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it did, however, have an immediate effect. Slaveholders throughout the South reviled it, criticized it, yelled and screamed and cursed it, sometimes within earshot of their enslaved people, who then spread the word. So in some sections of the country, here and there, enslaved people knew that freedom was on the horizon. But in a practical way, they didn't know how to access that freedom because freedom hadn't arrived, in the form of Union troops on their doorstep or whatnot. There were a few pockets throughout the South where Union troops, Union soldiers were stationed. And in those locations, there was often an adherence to the Emancipation Proclamation. Some people were able to leave plantations, or some enforcement of freedom or a system of compensation for enslaved people were enforced by Union troops. But for the most part, it was this idealized theoretical freedom only on paper. With the coming of the end of the Civil War, it was pretty much determined to be the law of the land. Of course, it took the passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to officially abolish slavery, the 14th Amendment to grant the rights of citizenship, and the 15th Amendment to grant voting rights only to African American men, not women. So out of, one movement into the next, in that time, I think people knew that freedom was coming. And so from place to place, they began to talk about and celebrate in many different ways what a new won freedom would be. In fact, even after the end of the Civil War, the opposite of freedom occurred in several places, where some enslaved people were learning about the end of the war, learning about their emancipation as late as the year 1867, and other parts of the country where I think they would call themselves unreconstructed Southerners refused to free their slaves. So they kept them on lockdown on plantations until the time where federal authorities could step in and mediate, actually grant physical freedom to those who had been held in bondage. So it's a often blurry time of history, one that still needs to be clarified and explored and discovered.
So then why June 19th, 1865? Why is that part of it clear?
The Texas thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in Texas, almost immediately the day appears to take hold. So June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger reads the Emancipation Proclamation to a group of enslaved people gathered at Galveston. Within the next year, there are the first formal celebrations. And at first, these are like, community gatherings. So they would have been times where family members that had been broken apart under slavery would have been reuniting, where people would have been, receiving their first form of compensation for their labor, where Black legislators were being elected to serve in state and national government positions by, say, the year 1870. So each year brought a little more freedom and more desire for celebration. So around this date, Juneteenth in Texas, you would have picnics and barbecue. Over time, people celebrated with parades. In my mom's hometown of Houston, Texas, in the early 1870s, Black citizens purchased land and established Emancipation Park, which is still there today in the neighborhood where my mom grew up. and just a block or two from where George Floyd went to school. And Emancipation Park was there as, public space for Black people, a place where they could gather socially and celebrate on June 19th. So it really remained a Texas celebration pretty much through the 19th century and early 20th century. Later, over time, especially once we get to the civil rights and post-civil rights movement, and there is more of a Black power movement, Black identity movement of the 1960s, people start looking to Juneteenth as a symbolic day for, recognition of emancipation generally. So, you always reach that 100-year mark, that 100-year century anniversary of something, and then there's a resurgence in interest. And that's what it appears as that happened with Juneteenth. And so Juneteenth starts popping up across the nation. Again, the subject of, local picnics and art festival. Juneteenth was the day where people would gather and read poems or sing songs by prominent African Americans. The Negro national anthem from the beginning of the 20th century, Lift Every Voice and Sing, becomes a favorite at Juneteenth celebrations. And so a history even between Juneteenth and, the 1960s, gets revitalized, and, people are relearning their history in the midst of making new history. And then you get to the 1980s and early 1990s, Juneteenth becomes adopted as a holiday, sometimes unofficial, sometimes official, by different state legislatures as this kind of, standalone historical marker for the freeing of slaves. And I believe as of today, there's only two states that don't recognize Juneteenth as a holiday in some kind of form or another. So the idea of freedom, I believe, is that there can't be too many holidays to celebrate freedom on.
True.
Right.
And none of us are free till we're all free, kind of thing. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Tony, you do such a great job of portraying the picture of how the emancipation wasn't an overnight thing. It sort of trickled out. Is that the word? It sort of happened over a period of time, which I think is a perspective that's important for us to understand as we look back on our American history. And I'm imagining those scenes you described of, someone coming into town, a Union officer, and saying, okay, you all are free now. A couple of things. First of all, would they have believed it? I mean, there might have been a lot of fear that it was, a trick or not true. And then also, they said, okay, now we're free, let's leave. I imagine that was an extremely dangerous proposition, because surely there were vigilante groups all over and people that were very angry about this and didn't want them to leave. So I don't know, give us some insight into that period. It's just kind of a gray area of freedom.
It's interesting because I think if we just step back into the period of slavery was a system that was colloquial and discretionary, meaning what it looked like, how it operated was really based regionally and on specific mores and values of those communities that it existed in.
Yeah.
And so, it's well known that slavery in Maryland, while every form and permutation of the system, brutal to harsh, existed, that Maryland, in terms of slavery, became known as the middle ground or the middle temperament, that the labor that enslaved people were engaged in here and the industries and so forth weren't as intense and labor intensive as, for instance, slavery in the Deep South, where you had a lower life expectancy, much harder conditions. So you have all of these different landscapes of geographical, economic, and social landscapes or terrains that, people had to negotiate. Even before the Civil War, there are accounts from slave narratives where several, almost any time power changed hands and a new president was going to be elected, one opponent or the other said, well, he'll free the slaves. And so there are actually accounts, election results coming back in certain places, and slaves throwing down their tools because their owner cursed or cussed about, this particular candidate would free the slaves. So they were sure that a positive election result was going to result in their freedom. And they were mistaken. Many were actually very politically savvy, having politicians in Southern legislatures, in the national legislature representing those districts from the South. And so they knew and could listen in on the political news that was being passed throughout the plantation house. So there was varying degrees of awareness. Even people who thought about escaping their captivity during their period of enslavement were told wild stories that the abolitionists would, tempt slaves north so they could enslave them there. On one plantation, a freedom seeker who actually made it to the north reported that his owner had told him many times that if you get to Canada, the Canada geese will peck out a black man's eye. And he determined in his mind that he'd take his chances with some, grumpy geese as opposed to being held in bondage for life. So he escaped. So, imagine, especially during the Civil War, Union troops coming through the South. It not only terrified slaveholders, but enslaved people themselves because they didn't know what the result would bring. But people knew what freedom was. They had a sense of it because they could see it every day. Their labor, their physical and economic sacrifice created freedom for those who kept them in bondage. So, freedom wasn't necessarily a locational thing. It wasn't necessarily like Canada. It wasn't terra firma. You didn't have to necessarily get to a particular geographic location. Freedom was, something within. It was the ability to chart one's own course and to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor.
Tony, are there instances where after the emancipation, they would begin to pay their former enslaved people and they stayed on in their situation?
Absolutely. And this occurred all throughout the South. Some planters established a wage and paid their formerly enslaved people. I know that here in Maryland, for instance, planters in Charles County, after Maryland abolished slavery, which I'll speak about in a moment, they quickly organized and established an agreed upon wage that would be paid to formerly enslaved people in Charles County. And that way, the formerly enslaved would not have bargaining power and could not demand from, one employer more than from another employer. Eventually, the tenant farming system was established throughout the South. And that was really a reach back to the slavery system, but with a, kind of newfangled twist. So planters would thank their formerly enslaved people for the years of service, but then offer to keep them on with wages. Mm-hmm. They would throw in the housing free of charge. You can live in that, live in the house, live in the same place where you have been and earn a wage. But under the tenant farming system, you would get your food sometimes and other supplies from the farm or plantation's general store. That could even include clothing and other types of goods and services. And at the end of the month or the end of the year, you would settle accounts. So your wages were paid after you had reimbursed the owner or the general store for expenses. And you want to take a guess?
Yeah,
That sounds like running a business.
Yeah.
Yes, expenses always outweighed earnings. But there was a solution to that. You were allowed to stay on for another year and do it all over again.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the best choice at the time. That's where the expression "the company store" comes from. And the meaning behind that. The meaning behind that is like the company store sort of owned you because of what Tony just described. Like you're always owing the company store, even though it's supposedly your money. So it's sort of a complicated thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though I'm guessing the term as we know it, the company store, probably comes in later,
the coal mining,
in places where they're like mining towns and stuff like that. They were absolutely drawing from a template, the template that came out of slavery earlier, and who knows, probably in different forms before that in other places. So freedom itself had a cost.
Yeah.
I would say we, in many ways, are still working at winning our freedoms.
Yeah.
Oh, Tony, I'm so glad you said that, because I was just thinking, we talk about slavery and enslaved people, and that, it ended during this period of history. But as you're pointing out, it just evolves. It's called different things. It takes different iterations. It has different nuances, but still to this day, and especially in our highly industrialized system, certainly the clothing industry, the food industry, there are people that are living under such restrictions and economic limitations. And I have a question for you. Why does it seem like we can't speak in terms of modern day slavery? That seems to be resisted. Is it because people feel like it minimizes that period in our history?
I think whenever and possibly wherever we are at any given time during the globe, on the globe, any reference to, any attention to injustice can appear to feel like an indictment. It's the mirror that we lift to our own face, and we can see all of our faults and shortcomings. And I think that makes people uncomfortable, especially when people start considering what their hand is in systems of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And so, taking that hard, introspective, critical look at ourselves, how we operate in the world, what our culpability might be, can be very difficult. And furthermore, if we disagree with the negative condition, if we're in our minds against slavery, but we buy our clothes from, foreign sweatshops, I think there is an internal pressure. Often we view it as an external pressure to change our behaviors. And when we look to change our behaviors, that often means giving up comfort or something that we might think of as our own freedoms. And then there's the conflict, which makes us no different than people of a century and a half ago, except that we have quasi better healthcare than them, better sewage and sanitation. Oh, well, maybe not. And we have more access to information, but not necessarily the ability or willingness to learn and act upon the lessons that greater knowledge provides us with.
To critically absorb information.
Yeah.
You got it. Exactly.
Here's something I've thought of recently. There's you'll hear a lot of commentary out there that the goods that are available at an affordable price are necessary for people of a certain economic level because that's all they can afford. So it's really hard to change the system because of accessibility. All right. So I'm thinking, how is that different from the plantation owners back in the early 19th century that said maybe slavery, maybe there's problems with it, but we can't afford anything else. Our economy won't work without this system. Are we not saying something similar now?
Yes, I believe so. Let's take, for instance, the fair trade movement, buying your products directly from locations, villages, whatnot, where those products are produced and the money can go directly back to them, is inspired either directly, indirectly, or happenstance by the free labor movement of the 1820s and 30s, where Quaker-run stores would offer items that were produced not through slave labor. Yes. So there was, many an abolitionist table in the North that did not have a sugar bowl because sugar was produced by enslaved people. The same thing with cotton. Cotton was a slave product. So it's not that we have newfangled ideas and new approaches, in the modern age. We draw from time-honored, freedom movements, but we're still needing to draw from time-honored freedom movements to exact the kind of change we want in the present.
How enlightened are we? Yeah.
What a loop.
Yeah, and I love the example of the sugar bowl on the table because that's the personal vision there of an individual or a family or a household that was one way in which they were not going to participate. And I think, the more we can educate people about how things arrive onto their table or into the stores, or so that people are able to make those decisions and begin an awareness of the complexity of this, that we're not talking about history. Juneteenth is not about something that happened in 1865 only. It has implications right now, every day, for all of us.
I love hearing about these Quakers and everyone in Maryland, and you have such a wealth of knowledge about Maryland specifically. So can you talk to us a little bit more about local emancipation and what happened here and is going on here?
Absolutely. Our area has a very interesting history. And again, we're still uncovering information almost every day. But Maryland is unique. During the Civil War, it was distinguished as a neutral state. It did not pick a side during the war. It was also, geographically situated. So the seat of our government in Washington, D.C. was, physically located in the South. The Southern legislature had withdrawn. So Congress during the Civil War mainly had Northern representation, but was surrounded by enemy territory. So Maryland remaining neutral allowed that essentially Northern government to continue. And it quickly moved to abolishing slavery in the district. In fact, it was April 16, 1862, when DC abolished slavery, and almost immediately, and to this day, that date in April is celebrated as DC Emancipation Day and is a city holiday.
Cool.
And was the subject of, again, street fairs going all the way up through the early teens, 19 teens, was the time of reunions of formerly enslaved people. There would be slave reunion as people spent decades reuniting and remembering what some of them refer to as the dark days, times of enslavement. But here in our county, for instance, we actually benefited strongly from DC emancipation. Under the federal act, you could free your enslaved people and be compensated, provided that you either were a resident of the district, that you had property holdings in the district, that your enslaved people, whether you were in Northern Virginia or suburban Maryland, were actually employed in the district, you could free them. So one amazing example of this locally was the Bell family of Rockville. If anyone's been to Montgomery County Historical Society, it's the location of the Bell Dawson House, which is owned by the city of Rockville, our 1815-ish federal brick mansion. And Margaret Bell, who was the patriarch of the estate at that time, freed, I believe it was either 17 or 19 of her enslaved people, for which she was compensated. I don't have the number right in front of me, but I think it was over $9,000 through this federal act. As a result, she then began selling to those formerly enslaved people for an amount fee simple of $5 plots of land, formerly of the Bell estate. So today, the Bell Dawson House is still there. It's kind of fronted by West Montgomery Avenue. Then it goes north, following to the west of North Washington Street in downtown Rockville, to a Black community called Hayti. And that's where the descendants, or the newly freed enslaved people from the Bells, purchased their lots, built their homes, and settled. And their descendants are still there today. If you were able to purchase one of those lots with a house on it, it could be $1 million. Who knows? Depending on the size of the lot. So you see the results of just an example of generational wealth that can be passed down when you own something. And so that's just one example of how an Emancipation Act actually helped transform a community.
I know there's many like freed slave communities around the county. We might have talked about this last time too. Is that related to the Bell estate?
Yes, there are many of them, and a lot of those settlements are carved from former estates, either on or adjacent to where those formerly enslaved people had been enslaved.
Interesting.
Some settlers of those areas, came from, other locations and bought land there. Some were the site of, kinship communities. So family units that extended back into slavery and, emerged after, where people who are related to one another settle in these unique enclaves. The other form of freedom that we added here in Maryland actually came in November 1st of 1864, when the state of Maryland changed its constitution to formally abolish slavery. And this occurred 6 months before the Civil War. And it was the first example of a state which abolishes slavery through popular vote. So it wasn't the state legislature deciding, it was the people. And it was a close vote. It almost didn't happen, but it did. And there was also a hope there that perhaps slaveholders would be compensated for their loss. And for those listening in, I'm saying loss with air quotes. Ultimately, they didn't get compensation, but as part of the process to consider compensation, we have the records of all the slaveholders in Maryland who claimed, who held people at the time of the Civil War, and it lists those enslaved people by name. So, one result of Maryland emancipation is if your family goes back in Maryland to that period of time, whether you're enslaved or a slaveholder, those records are there. And that kind of information is now being the source of helping African Americans break through that, firewall to learn where they came from, and for descendants of slaveholders to break through what became a wall of silence within their families and sometimes their communities, and actually know who their ancestors had possession of, and to start bridging gaps, start uniting, starting to reach out and face our history together. And, I couldn't think of a better time in our history for people to be coming together to face our nation's original sin and then create something new.
Yeah. Tony, how do you celebrate Juneteenth?
Well, with a party if I can, margarita, sometimes a good whisk, always at least half of the day napping. That is true freedom, getting to nap with the phone turned off.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I run the Button Farm Living History Center. So usually I'm speaking at an event or, doing something history related. So, basically out there communing with the community. My nonprofit, the Veneer Foundation, actually runs a heritage tour company. And so this Juneteenth, we have our first vaxxed busload of people coming to Maryland to do a tour of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway in Dorchester County and visit the Harriet Tubman Museum and State Park. So I'm spending my Juneteenth this year introducing people to Maryland's history, our amazing legacy of struggle for dignity and human rights, and we'll have some good food and maybe a drink or two along the way.
And now that things are opening up, what are Button Farm's plans for the tourism stuff? Or has any of that moved up at all? Or are you still kind of like on pause till 2022?
We are not on pause. We are go, go, go.
Yay.
We opened the farm this year to camping on, I believe it was March 15th. Usually we don't even open the farm to volunteers until April because, you have the winter snow and the grounds are wet and, you bring anyone to the farm, they get stuck in the mud. But this year was a fairly dry winter, so we got a 2-month jump on our normal schedule. So we opened it up to camping. If anyone wants to camp at Button Farm, you can find us on hipcamp.com. And then we brought in volunteers beginning in April to help, start dewinterizing the farm and getting ready for visitors. May 1st, we opened up to the general public. We have a park, what we call a park and play pass, $10 a vehicle, come out to the farm. You can do self-guided tours. You can get on your bike and ride the trails around the farm. You can bring your own picnic, just, spend a number of hours here out in the fresh air. This month, June, we started guided tours. So every weekend I do a guided tour of the farm called Button Farm Almanac. And it's kind of the A to Z of the farm, what happens here, and the samples of the programs that we do. Coming up in July will actually be the 25th anniversary of my walk to Canada, my 1996 expedition from Maryland to Canada. And so
that's weird because you're 25, aren't you?
Thank you. Close. I'm 26.
You must have done that walk when you were
I'm
like
26.
3. Yeah.
I'm 26.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll take the compliment. Yes, I was an infant when I crawled to Canada. Love you. But yes, so I'll be doing a silver anniversary presentation. And then we're just going to have a summer of some interesting things. I think everything by Juneteenth, our full schedule will be on our website, so people can check that out. But it'll be different local art and artisans who will be here at the farm throughout the summer. We'll have a number of new tour experience. We'll have some old traditions. In September, we'll bring back our annual drinks on the veranda. Where you come out and taste some get the local spirit, as we say, and relax. And then everything from Underground Railroad night hikes to some events leading up to Emancipation Day at the end of October. So listeners can, check out our website, buttonfarm.org. There's a calendar there. Yeah, just celebrate the new freedom we all have
Yeah,
as we
certainly.
break the shackles
Yes.
of mask wearing and,
Isolation.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, boy, it's a really different scenario from when we talked to you last
Yeah.
time, whenever that was, back in January or whatever. And it just sounds like a whole new world.
That's
And you
so
guys
exciting.
sound so busy. Wow. I appreciate so much your historical perspective on all of this, your historical and your human perspective on the whole thing. And I've gained so much understanding today and so much insight into this. And I just really appreciate you coming on and just talking to us about
I
it.
know, and I feel so lucky that we're neighbors.
I
I'm like,
know.
sorry, anyone who doesn't live here.
And I know.
Me too. And
Come visit.
and I'd like to just say one last thing in parting. I love this podcast. You did this. You were so gracious to invite me on last year, and recently we sent out a newsletter and we put in that previous podcast. And within a week, a bunch of people just showed up at the farm because they were inspired by it.
Whoa.
And we are both you two and Button Farm are in our county's ag reserve. And for people who haven't been to the ag reserve, it's just this beautiful swath of our county where the emphasis is on land conservation and digging in the dirt and planting on some of the mini farms. But there's something else that happens here. There's a sense of community, and it's not an exclusive community. Everything we do here is to welcome people in and create community for the
Yes.
larger community. So I just want to thank you for doing so much for the greater community, to create and expand community, to bring people together, and then provide places, whether it's virtual through a podcast or physical, where people can come, where they can open their minds, where they can get a moment to breathe and step back, where they can rejuvenate themselves, like at one of your great retreats, right? And then go back into the world fully juiced up, inspired, ready to take it on and to bring about change. All of that says freedom to me. And I think it's a great inspiration for this Juneteenth or any Juneteenth. Thank you. Just thank you for what you do. And thank you for being friends. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much. We're
Let's
over
just
here.
wipe our eyes over here. Jesus.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Tony. Okay. So should we
Well.
sign off? And then
Yeah, I think that was a great ending.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
We'll include that every week.
Yeah.